Welcome to episode 5 of the History Hour with Mr. Kent
and Professor White.
An interesting behind-the-scenes thought for a moment. Initially, the 4th episode of this series had been planned to be the final, but as we progressed, there turned out to be more to say than we'd initially thought. Brevity had to be sacrificed somewhat in the interest of actually giving our listeners an actual understanding of the subject at hand. And I, at least, found that there were new things to be learned about the topic. I had initially flipped through my old college notes from my Mesopotamian history course and thought to myself, yeah, all this sounds familiar. But as I went looking elsewhere, there were a lot of things I'd never considered. It's been a learning experience. And not only because I'm still shaking my fist at video editing and audio issues, and as a result, we've stretched this series further than we expected. With that in mind, we still have given a very short, very quick overview. For part 5 of our series, we will have a dramatic flashback. We have mentioned the Assyrians and the Assyrian state many times in this series. Last installment, we covered the Bronze Age collapse, and in the wake of it, Assyria, the often vassalized or conquered northern portion of Mesopotamia, is, despite all odds, about to become the unchallenged power of the region. Assyria, which had faced the Kassite and Hittite aggression seemingly from the moment it cast off its Mitanni yoke, had become one of the mighty military powers of the Near East, but with the collapse, so too did it fall from power. Before we leap into those details, we will instead consider what laid the groundwork for what Assyria would become, the largest and bloodiest empire mankind had yet known. In fact, Assyria represents the last great Mesopotamian power. What had once been the northern fringes of the Akkadian Empire, where merchants brought back goods from faraway Hittite lands, would become, perhaps, the first military hyperpower in history. When we talk about Assyria, what exactly are we talking about? In later periods, the Assyrian people, the Assyrian kings, called themselves that. There is a connection to Assyrian language and Assyrian culture. We initially, when we look at the area that would later become Assyria, have to look all the way back to the periods we talked about in episode 1. In fact, the Shamshi-Adad cave we talked about, Neanderthals finds, is actually located in the region that would become Assyria. And Assyria is home to multiple archaeological finds from the Jarmo culture, the Halaf culture, the Kusuna culture, indicating that people had been in Assyria for a long time, indicating that Assyrian culture and Mesopotamian culture existed side by side, in some cases potentially for centuries and millennia. Just in the earliest periods, when the South was urbanizing and following the trend of centralized government, essentially the Uruk period followed by the Dynastic period, which would eventually culminate in the Sargonic period and the first large-scale empire. Assyria instead was still in a more subsistence-based lifestyle. They were still relying upon pastoral nomadism. In fact, when you look to their own histories, their Assyrian king list, when they talk about this period, they refer to their rulers as the kings who lived in tents. These kings who lived in tents, interestingly, are said to have been those that Hammurabi descended from, indicating that by the Assyrians' own admissions, maybe they have some origins among the Amorites, though that might just be some later additions to the list. Some artistic license given to the list. We'll talk about that.
Interestingly enough, given the fact that the Assyrian peoples are pastoral peoples for much of their early history, there's pretty strong evidence that the first urban centers, the first serious urban centers to emerge here, actually are probably Sumerian outposts of some sort, whether they are trade colonies or perhaps administrative centers, outposts. It's hard to say exactly what. But the earliest of these date to around 2600 BCE. And it would seem as if Assyria during this early Uruk periods and after served as an important mercantile center. This is a place where people from the cities of the south went to trade, to bring back riches and wealth and resources and the like. The thing is, it isn't just that Assyria itself has resources, it does, but Assyria seems to be something of a great cultural crossroads of the north. Even in this very early period, it looks like they have contact with people of coastal Syria, people of mountainous central Anatolia, perhaps even beyond into the Caucasus and the Armenia region. And one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have for this is the Sumerians themselves referred to this land, which they use the term Sufartu to refer to it as. They call it the place where languages are confused, referring to the fact that there was perhaps a dominant local language, but that people from all sorts of regions and all sorts of dialects and language groups apparently came here, gathered here, traded here, met here. And thus, again, Assyria serves as this very interesting gateway to the world for Mesopotamia, and for the early Sumerians, they're very valuable at that. Indeed, to jump ahead to the early dynastic period, there are actually a number of kings, two in particular, that specifically reference not just Assyria itself, but also specifically reference either attacking Sumeria or extracting tribute from Sumeria, or just dealing with it in some way. They specifically mention either attacking Assyria or extracting tribute from it in some fashion. For example, Eannatum, who was the king of Lagash, in one of his annals makes the reference of he smote Subartu, basically attacked it, defeated it, and inflicted some sort of humiliation upon it. The king of the city of Adab, Lugo Anemundu, he makes reference to receiving gifts of tribute from Subartu, which, interestingly enough, while it does suggest that Assyria still has at least an economic role and a political role in larger Sumerian affairs, it also seems to imply that the Assyrians have gained a certain degree of independence. Because if the earliest Assyrian settlements are old Sumerian outposts and colonies, well, not unheard of perhaps to attack a rival city's colonies, but it seems to imply that Assyria is now a land of independence to some degree. And in fact, as early as, say, 2450 BCE, we do find at least some limited records that even if Assyria was not united, at least the central cores around what will become cities like Ashur and Nineveh do seem to have been ruled by a single figure. There's a tablet called the Eblite tablet found in the area, which mentions the king Tudia by name as king of the Assyrians. And the figure treaty talks about the king authorizing the creation of a trade colony, which is a karum in Assyrian, which refers to a very specific kind of both a merchant organization and a trade organization and a colony and an expedition. It's a very complex thing. One of those fascinating Assyrian customs which is hugely important to its history. Assyria seems to recognize at least some kind of central authority in parts, and seems to be organizing these large-scale merchant expeditions to some degree, even if the region is still largely pastoral at this time.
The Karim themselves at this point would be the most significant in Asia Minor, what would later become the lands ruled by the Hittites. The Karim here essentially appear to be these sort of tax-free portion cities used by Assyrian merchants, essentially given over by local governments to them. They would develop it, they'd bring forth needed goods, the kings would have access to those goods, the merchants would thus enrich themselves. It was a sort of beneficial cycle. This would have been the thing we talked about in earlier episodes, where as the Assyrians bring in their goods, they would have brought language, writing, ideas, whatnot with them. And just as in the earliest periods, the areas of Sumer would have looked to Akkad and Kish-like to be a sort of northerly frontier, and as those areas become part of the greater whole, they look to Subartu and Assyria as sort of frontier. Anatolia is the sort of frontier to the Assyrians. As the Assyrians become more developed and have these ideas and establish their own language and customs, they sort of import these to Anatolia, which later becomes that cycle we spoke of with the Hittites. As the early dynastic period gave way to the Sargonic period, Sargon the Great expanded through the river valleys, incorporated the various city-states in the empire, and so too did Assyria actually become incorporated. It seems as though Assyria more or less became an outpost. They established it as a province of the empire, and that region he seemed to launch expeditions, campaigns, perhaps just raids also into the area of the Mediterranean coast as well as Anatolia. But at that time it was incorporated seemingly as a sort of governor-ruled section of his empire.
It seems that while there is some discussion and some debate over exactly how extensive Sargon's empire actually was, while he claims to rule the people of Subartu, does that refer to the entire land or as part of it? The closest we can say is that there is a reference in Akkadian records to the city of Ashur, which becomes historically one of the main cities of the Assyrian state, its main religious center later on. And this city, by name, is mentioned as the seat of the Akkadian governor of Assyria, in what's called the Nuzi tablets. So this seems to give strong indication that even if Sargon's reach doesn't nearly extend as far as he claims it does, at the very least, at least part of Assyria is part of his empire and is beginning to urbanize and develop during this period.
Like other areas of the empire, Assyria seems to have rebelled at some point during the reign of Sargon, possibly also during the reign of his successors. However, the Assyrians were put down, they were reincorporated into the Sargonic Empire. It was not until the fall of the Sargonic Empire, when the Gutians invaded, that Assyria broke free and appears not to have actually been dominated by the Gutians. During this period, Assyria seems nominally independent and have a sort of nominal self-identity beginning to become established in this period. And in fact, when the Ur III dynasty arose and created the sort of Neo-Sumerian Empire, the city of Ashur was actually conquered, was incorporated into the empire, but Nineveh and portions of North Assyria actually remained independent. And the title that the governor used of the region of Ur III controlled Assyria was actually Shakanaku, like the dynasty of Mari. So one of the notable things about Assyria in these early days, one of the major exports it had then and even for centuries to come until the late Bronze Age, was metal and the actual high craftsmanship of metallurgy in the Assyrian region, somewhat like the Hittites would later display. So the question arises, how is it that this northern frontier area had more advanced metallurgy than the south? It's possible that the Assyrians had access to copper earlier, and in fact, in some ways, it's possible that their access to copper and the working of it became so valuable that they were able to command a price for the market with the Uruk merchants. As a result, because of the value commanded in Uruk and Sumer, it drove them to produce more. While they weren't so worried about grain, they were able to do more specialization toward metallurgy rather than toward canal building and farming. And in fact, some of the earliest sites we find, specifically at Yarim Tepe and Tel Magdalea, which are both found in the upper Tigris in the Syrian region, both seem to have been smelting copper around the year 6000 BCE. And in fact, Yarim Tepe also shows some of the earliest signs we find of lead working. Assyria was not the first region to discover the forging of bronze, however. The forging of bronze seems to have first originated in Serbia rather than Mesopotamia, but the Mesopotamian invention seems to have been a local thing, not imported from that region. The earliest Mesopotamian bronze does not appear to have come from Assyria, but may have instead been from South Mesopotamia, Sumer and Akkad and Uruk in that region. However, the earliest Mesopotamian bronzes were most likely not tin forged bronze, they were instead arsenic forged bronzes. While effective, while useful, also have the tendency to poison the people making them. So arsenic eventually gave way to the more efficient, more safe products made by the Assyrians and later Hittites, the tin-forged bronze, requiring the importation from sources like Afghanistan. So while we've talked about this, what are the Assyrians saying themselves? Like many regions, writing does not survive in huge amounts from this period. However, we do have the Assyrians' king list. The Assyrian king list is a large list found in multiple locations, which lists just a massive amount of kings, and most of these lists more or less agree with each other. There are many rulers who are never attested anywhere else. Essentially, they are named on the list, but no external records ever acknowledge them having existed. There are also some individuals who we're fairly sure were kings of places like Assyria, or at least the city of Ashur, but are not on the list. So it seems as though the king list is not 100% accurate. It seems as though the king list has maybe some stretching of the truth in it. What many scholars believe is that the king's list is actually a list created initially by the Amorite Shamshi-Adad to legitimize himself, and it was adopted by preceding rulers to legitimize them by linking them to the ruler Shamshi-Adad.
As has been mentioned, the earliest set of kings on this Assyrian kings list are referred to as the kings who lived in tents, even if some of them, by other accounts, are recognized as the kings of cities like Assur. It still shows that strong pastoral relationship and culture that was discussed. The first king on the list, actually as mentioned, was Tudia, who we think was actually probably a real king of some sort, since there are some other supplementary sources, like the Evelite tablet that mention him. But most of the kings on this early part of the list are relatively unknown. We have rough, or what we think of are the rough dates of their reign. So there is, as is often the case with ancient history, some controversy over how exactly these dates line up, how these match up, where exactly they fall together, what chronology to use. It's a big mess sometimes, but we have these names. And the big name on this list, one of the last kings on this list, a king we're pretty confident was real, is a man named Ushpia. Now Ushpia is not quite the last of the kings who lived in tents. But he's a somewhat legendary figure in Assyrian kingly chronology, it seems, in the sense that he's often acknowledged as the first king to rule over an independent Assyria after the Ur III dynasty collapses. He's said to have dedicated temples to the god Ashur, in the city of Assur. In fact, by some accounts, he's said to have founded the city of Assur. This is probably not true. Again, while there is some controversy over dates, and you can make some guesses about this, the suspected reign years of Ushpia fall about 250 or so years after the death of Sargon. And remember, Sargon, in his own accounts, is referencing the city of Ashur and talking about it as an administrative outpost of his empire. In fact, it would be another relatively minor king on this list called Hana, who, if the dates are correct, would have been a contemporary with Sargon and would have been, in theory, the ruler of Assyria at this time. So while there's definitely some confusion over the specifics, and Ushpia probably isn't the founding father of Assyrian urbanism, as some might claim, he was nonetheless a very significant figure. Again, other accounts do talk about him dedicating temples and buildings and cities and the like throughout the region. There's few specifics known about exactly what he built beyond that temple, supposedly. But it was supposedly during his reign, again, these mass projects were conducted, that urbanization, if not began, at least expanded, perhaps considerably. And there's also massive expansion of Assyrian economic trade interests in Anatolia at this time. Again, through the so-called Hatti tablets and a few other sources, there are a number of new kadum founded during Ushpia's reign that really begins to cement Assyria during this new period of independence following the end of Ur III as a new economic power in the region, and in a few years, a major partner of the new rising Hittite kingdom of central Turkey. There are some also scattered accounts of them fighting wars and campaigns in southern Mesopotamia, either against other Sumerian cities or against the Elamites in one case. In fact, one particular source claims that Ushpia fought the Elamites to protect the Akkadians of Sumeria and Mesopotamia from their deprivations. Is that true? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. What we can say with some degree of confidence is that some of the earliest known written law codes date either around this time or just after it. In addition to this, the introduction of what are called the Limu Lists, which is basically an Assyrian account of years. It's somewhat strange to modern ears, but Limu Lists are basically every year an official was appointed to keep track of events that happened during that year. That year was then named for the man who kept the records. The Limu is the record of that year's events, and the year itself named for the man keeping the records. So in theory, you can line up these Limu one after the other, year after year, and get an account of who's ruling, what's being done, what's happening, and who is actually keeping the records. But of course, we don't have access to all of them, and we don't know if any are missing, and we also don't know how accurate some of the earliest ones actually are. So again, the science of actually lining up the Limu list to figure out what happens when is a matter of some debate. And some historians actually think that it probably was more than a generation later these were actually introduced. Some scholars say it's a much later king, the later dynasty called Edoshum I, who actually introduces the practice of the Limu list, but it is somewhat apocryphally attributed to Ushpia by some accounts as well. Again, cementing this man as something of a founding father of the Assyrian state in their own minds.
And the topic of Limu Lists, there is some controversy with dating. Apparently there's been some projects to line up all the various dates in these and use those to have a rough guide of the actual chronology of the Assyrians. And apparently that leans toward the ultra-short chronology, meaning that they were relatively quicker and more recent than perhaps was the most commonly accepted explanation today. So all kinds of cutting-edge research out there.
As we've said previously, history is not a static discipline. There's new discoveries and new research and new ideas all the time, which only makes it both more interesting and more frustrating at the same time.
After the kings who lived in tents, the Assyrian king list then names the kings whose fathers are known. These seem to be kings who were perhaps either the direct ancestors of Shamshi-Adad, his father, grandfather, forefathers, that sort of thing, or perhaps they had been the actual rulers of the city of Assur, which Shamshi-Adad was then claiming descent from to legitimize himself. Whatever the case, this list seems at this point to be aimed toward putting some legitimacy to the beginnings of the old Assyrian Empire. Essentially, it's possibly compiling lists of the various Amorites who had been kings prior to the coming of Shamshi-Adad, perhaps that he was a direct blood descendant of, perhaps the same as Hammurabi, perhaps also compiling a list of all the names of the rulers of the city of Assur, perhaps also compiling the chieftains of the region. It's not entirely sure who all these people were, but wherever they claim Shamshi-Adad and later rulers would claim that these were the individuals who they claimed descent and thus sort of authority from. Interestingly, these early Assyrians seem to have names that actually appear slightly more Hurrian, essentially kind of similar to the Mitanni groups we'll talk about somewhat later. The early Assyrians might have actually been speaking closer to a Hurrian dialect, and they might have actually been ethnically closer to them, and perhaps even the Kassites. It's unknown because those languages aren't 100% known, and there's controversy over whether or not Hurrian and Kassite are actually related, but it once again goes into the whole thing about the area where languages are confused. However, as the Sumerian contact increases and the Akkadians exert their influence in the region, their names transition to look more Akkadian and Sumerian in their makeup. Though there also are some alternate theories that state that the Assyrian names in this period, prior to the Akkadian-Sumerian contact, actually resemble closer to Amorite names, and perhaps those visuals saying the king list claim that some of those Amorite kings were actually kings of Assyria. Perhaps there's some credence to that, and the Amorite groups, the early Assyrian or early Hurrian groups were somewhat similar, but once again, big controversy about exactly what happens when and who is whom. And then another short part on the Assyrian king list is the kings whose names are written on bricks, whose eponyms are unknown. These appear to be the individuals who says were the rulers of Assyria, or at least the city of Ashur, sort of linking them with building projects, walls, temples, cities, and the like. The first dynasty, noted to be a part of the old Assyrian Empire, is the dynasty of Ashur. Notably, this is the first dynasty that appears to have Assyrian names, indicating a sort of new linguistic and maybe even a sort of nationalistic cultural identity, a sort of asserting their own unique names rather than the old school Amorite / Hurrian / Akkadian / whatever. The founder of this dynasty, Ashur, is mostly known from the inscriptions of his descendants, but he's said to have restored the city walls of Ashur. Assyria at this time was becoming a moderate power. It had essentially continued to expand its trade networks, and it was expanding outward and becoming actually significantly notable in the period following the fall of Sargon. In the period in which Mari and Hammurabi and Eshnunna and the other powers began to emerge, Assyria was a rivaling peer power at this time. And in fact, when Amorites moved into the region, Assyria held out longer than most of Lower Mesopotamia, but around 1809 BCE, it did ultimately fall to Shamshi-Adad. Shamshi-Adad is first attested in history as the ruler of a city called Ekalatum. The city passed to him from the king Il-Kabu. The Assyrian king list claims that he was the father of Shamshi-Adad, but others suggest that perhaps instead Shamshi-Adad conquered it from Il-Kabu. The name Ekalatum actually means the palace and seemed to have been a center of an Amorite dynasty which may have been related to Hammurabi, given that he claimed descent from some of the same people who Shamshi-Adad claimed descent from. But the location of the city of Ekalatum is still undiscovered to this day. During Shamshi-Adad's reign, Naram-Sin of Eshnunna seemingly was in power and expanded, attacking the city of Ekalatum and sending Shamshi-Adad into exile in Babylonia. It was not until the death of Naram-Sin of Eshnunna that Shamshi-Adad returned. Upon his return, he not only retook the city of Ekalatum, but he also began a series of expansions. Most notable of these, he rebuilt the long-abandoned town of Shakuna and renamed it and made it a new capital, Shubat-Enlil, or resident of the god Enlil. Originally, Shubat-Enlil had been a farming village in 5000 BCE, and it had become an Akkadian outpost. However, drought had left it abandoned for over 300 years by the time Shamshi-Adad rebuilt it into the city. After this, he also defeated Yadun-Lim of Mari and seized the city and its valuable trade routes, those that stretched from Anatolia to Mesopotamia in this time. Zimri-Lim was then exiled to the Amorite nation of Yamhad.
A number of things indicate that this was not the only or indeed the most significant expansion that Shamshi-Adad undertook. There are accounts that speak of him also seizing territory in Anatolia itself, in Syria and the Levant, and perhaps all the way to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And indeed, it was something of a long-standing ambition, both before and long after this king, that Assyria wanted to gain a window on the sea, as it might be called, given the fact that they were a landlocked power. And trade over the water has always been one of the more profitable in this period.
With all these conquests, Shamshi-Adad ruled an empire of North Mesopotamia and called himself King of All. During the time of his expansion victories, he also aligned with Deshusha of Eshnuna, and despite later battles between them, they at times cooperated and conquered territory together. After Shamshi-Adad's death, his son Ishme-Dagon took the throne. However, almost immediately after, the empire began to shrink. Zimri-Lem retook Mari. Eshnuna began to conquer cities near the center of Ashur itself. They also faced raids and incursions from the Zagros Mountains. Not specifically named, but likely Gutians or maybe even early Kassite raids into the region.
But of course, as we should know, the big contender, the big danger of the future was Babylon. And while Hammurabi had yet to forge the great empire he'd be known for, it seems that even as early as Ishme-Dagon's reign, relationships with the city of Babylon were beginning to deteriorate, and it looked as if war was in the future.
However, after Ishme-Dagon's death, Mut-Askur came to the throne. After defeating Mari, Larsa, and Eshnuna, Hammurabi of Babylon attacked and defeated Assyria. During the reign of Mut-Askur, trade with Anatolia stopped after the center of the trade network at Kanesh was burned. Traditionally, the burning of this trade center was often blamed on Eshnuna due to its conquest of Ashur at the time. However, some have suggested that instead it may be raids from the rival city of Zapua led by Anu in Anatolia. However, there are alternate theories. Some have suggested that, and it's an old theory, that the Babylon, having more or less imposed dominion over Assyria at this time, was forcing them to either directly pay them tribute instead of trading, or simply move their merchant colonies to the south to instead trade their valuable goods to Babylonia rather than to the Hittite lands. Possible other theory for the disruption of the trade network is the Hurrians at this time, a possible semi-related group of the Assyrians, were expanding in other areas, and they may have also been conducting raids either on the trade routes or on the trade centers themselves. During this time, one of Hammurabi's successors, Shamshu-Iluna, likely destroyed the center of Shuba-Enlil, trying to break Assyrian influence in the region. More or less, they feared, I would assume, that the city built by Shamshi-Adad, with all of his rulers and power centers there, represented a strong regional, local opposition to them, and by eliminating it, they hoped to break Assyrian influence and decentralize them back into the older ways. However, at this time, Ishme-Dagon and his successors, Ramush and Asnu, were vassal kings of the Babylonians, and they seemed to prove somewhat unpopular people since they were bending the knee to an unpopular foreign regime.
Despite this, however, Assyria was actually in a reasonably good position in some ways. Despite the humiliating defeat they had suffered at Hammurabi, despite the loss of a major city, despite the unpopularity of being vassals to a foreign king, unlike many other cities that the Babylonians warred with and conquered, Assyria was at least able to maintain a nominal independence. While Babylon begins to experience a decline of its own, the Assyrians are actually in a fairly good position to attempt to reassert their independence once, the authority of Hammurabi's dynasty begins to wane.
The next period talked about in the Assyrian king list is a list of 7 usurpers. Their names are listed as Ashur-Dagul, Ashur-Apli-Idi, Nasir-Sin, Sin-Namir, Ipqui-Ishtar, Adad-Salulu, and Adasi. The list claims that they are sons of nobody without right to rule. It's a phrase you see at other times. Son of nobody. It seems to mean that it's someone who's a usurper king. It doesn't necessarily literally mean that they don't know who their father is. It means that they're not descended from a king, that they're usurper, that they're not proper, etc., etc. It's sort of kingly propaganda to say that this person has no actual authority to do what they're doing. This is a person who's trying to claim that they're something that they're not, more or less. What these 7 usurpers could have represented might have been 7 different warring nations, might have been just 7 different city-states or warlords, maybe contemporaneous, maybe not, or it could have been a series of 7 coups. Whatever the case, it seems there were 7 individuals who attempted to seek power in the era following the direct dynasty of Shamshi-Adad in the waning days of Hammurabi and Babylon. And out of these 7, eventually came the last of them, Adasi. Adasi was the one able to actually secure domain over all of Assyria, bring in the find, and restabilize the region, and also establish the longest lasting dynasty in all of Assyrian history, the Adassid dynasty. And it was Adasi and the Adassid dynasty that would fully expel the Babylonians and reassert Assyrian dominance and Assyrian independence in the next era. The first king of this new dynasty after the founder, Belbani, Adasi's son, the 48th king on the Assyrian king list, ascended the throne of Assyria. During his reign, he inflicted further defeats on the Babylonians, reassert Assyrian domination and independence, and in general, Assyria seems to have become a powerful state once more. During his reign, there's known to be much rebuilding, expansion, and mercantile activity that occurred throughout the region. Assyria became a regional power as Babylon declined, and just as Sumer and Akkad and the others had sort of begun to dominate the region, for a moment it looked as though Assyria was about to do the same. And in fact, this was when the Hittites were first coming to power. They conducted their attack on Babylon just as Assyria was beginning to reassert itself and gain its feet, as it were. The Kassites came to power in the wake of Marcellus' raid on the city, and Assyria during this time seems to have been more or less passed over by them. The Marcellus did not raid into Assyria's homeland. Instead, they were internally focused and relatively stable, able to fend off foreign threats and contain any sort of domestic problems. However, what this all set the stage for is a new contender. Babylonian weakness, Kassite invasions, and Assyrian semi-isolation left a sort of power vacuum when the Hittite army suffered its coup and the new power withdrew. As the Hittites suddenly withdrew and the other powers were unable or unwilling to step into the vacuum, it was instead an old group who returned. The Hurrians would reemerge as the Mitanni.
So, who exactly or what exactly is Mitanni? We've talked about that a few times here. We talked about it with the Hittites as well. Mitanni are a kingdom that emerges in northern Mesopotamia, also pushing into Syria, the Levant, and parts of Anatolia at its height, that emerges perhaps as early as 15th century BCE. The Mitanni are essentially a Hurrian-speaking people who emerge, again, probably around between 15 to 1300 BCE in this northern Mesopotamia, eastern Syria, Anatolia region. The problem is, well, we know a lot about them. Not a lot comes from themselves. In fact, there aren't really many, or even in some cases any, native sources about Mitanni. Almost everything we have about them was written either by the Egyptians, or by the Hittites, or by the Assyrians themselves. And so while that does leave us with some problems as historians, we have to be very careful of thinking about, well, what did these groups want to tell us about this group they were dealing with? What was the actual truth? By comparing and contrasting them, we can get a decent picture of what we are dealing with. Now, it seems that the Mitanni, or what would become the state of Mitanni, slowly begins to emerge as a fringe power in the latter years of Babylon before its total decline. In this period, it wasn't an extremely strong power, but was extremely well positioned. You see, much of the city-state of Mari had been centuries earlier, in a position to control and potentially dominate overland trade between the Mediterranean, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, so too was Mitanni strategically positioned to control these overland routes, or at least potentially able to control these overland routes. Now, Mitanni themselves are interesting. They are, as mentioned, a Hurrian-speaking people, which means they spoke a dialect known as Hurrian. The Hurrian dialect itself is a linguistic group that actually comes from the Caucasus, particularly the Armenia region, which, as we mentioned all the way back in video 1, had a long history of trade and economic connection with Mesopotamia. As far as we can tell, the Hurrians themselves seem to be related to, perhaps even descendant from, another language group in the region called Urartan. And as early as perhaps 2300 BCE, the Hurrians migrate into this region that we call Mitanni. As an aside, their cousins, the Urartans, who stay up in the Caucasus, will actually organize themselves into a kingdom and become a major power during the Neo-Assyrian period. We got a few centuries to go before we get to that point. Now, one interesting side note, however, is that while a Hurrian dialect appears to be spoken at this time, there's also the presence of Indo-European words in the languages and texts and surviving things we do have. Interestingly enough, these mostly seem related to certain gods, to things like horses, chariots, and similar sorts of things, as well as in the names of many aristocrats and leaders of the Mitanni state. Now, there are a number of theories as to why this is. One of the oldest is that, well, this clearly represents some sort of Indo-European aristocracy ruling over a Hurrian-speaking majority. A conquering group of some type, perhaps a horse chariot or other horse-using people have come in, subdued and conquered the region, established themselves as kings and lords, and thus their names survive as the leadership caste, if you will, of the Mitanni, and their words for their type of warfare enter into language. Other theories suspect a less destructive or less violent approach. Other theories claim that similar to how Indo-European and native Anatolian dialects would merge from a slow migration to create the Hittites, perhaps a similar process was occurring here. As evidence for this, they point out that in places like Greece, for example, a very similar process occurred of Indo-European migration, merging with native dialects, creating a new language out of this. Given that Indo-European words really only seem to appear in relationship to the aristocracy, does give strong credence to the idea that they were a ruling group who imposed themselves on the Mitanni, but no conclusive evidence has emerged as of yet as to exactly what happened.
In addition, the Indo-Aryan connection is also speculated to maybe instead be in relation to Kassite. Maybe those words and those names are actually closer to Kassite names. But then there's those who say that, Kassite's also related to Aryan. So it's a big confusing thing with different theories adopting different evidences and trying to advocate for one point of view or another. And further complicated by the fact that it's all speculation as to, these names and whatnot on records. Because by the time the Mitanni are exchanging letters with other states, they're writing Hurrian. Even the nobility is using a Hurrian language and not an Indo-European language.
After King Mursilis of the Hittites leads his great raid down and breaks the power of Babylon, the Mitanni were actually left in a much better position by this. Largely because, as we've mentioned in our previous video, the Hittites descend into a civil war, a minor civil war in crisis after this, and the Old Kingdom goes into a decline. A power vacuum is left behind with the fall of Babylon, and there's no one immediately positioned to take advantage of this. And the Mitanni are simply quick enough or lucky enough to actually slip into that vacuum and establish themselves as a dominant power in northern Mesopotamia. All throughout the 15th and 14th centuries, the Mitanni will expand their territory considerably, pushing into eastern parts of Anatolia, into Syria, the Levant, even exerting influence over the core Assyrian territories for a time.
With the rise of the Mitanni, or Hanagalbat as it would have been known to the Assyrians, they came to assert dominance over a number of regions. When they began to contest the region of Canaan with the other dominant power in the region, Egypt began to seek new allies. They looked to Assyria, which did sit on Mitanni's border and could potentially pose a threat to it. Amenhotep II sent tribute of gold to Assyria, hoping to win favor of Ashur-nadin Ahi I. However, this prompted the Mitanni Emperor Shashtatar to invade and defeat Assyria, reducing it to a sometimes vassal and sometimes tributary power. Despite the power of the Mitanni and the size of their empire and the territories they controlled, Assyria was not so easy to subjugate. It was only forced to pay tribute at times, and at other times the Mitanni seemed either unwilling or unable to actually militarily intervene and force the tribute or loyalty of their vassal subject.
Indeed, at the height of its power, the Mitanni even clashed with Egypt. During this period, the Egyptians were asserting their own imperial prerogatives and pushing into the Levant themselves, and there are a number of battles and minor wars fought between Mitanni and Egypt during this period. Though, unlike, say, later Hittites, who would have some very vicious and bitter wars with the Egyptians, ultimately culminating in the Battle of Dash, the Mitanni actually managed to reverse this during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and actually make an alliance with the Egyptians, solidifying the border and ending that conflict. And as was often the case, sealing this pact by sending a Mitanni princess to join the Egyptian pharaoh's harem. Unfortunately for the Mitanni, despite the fact that they were able to acquire relative peace with their most powerful neighbor, Egypt, other factors began to take hold. Hittites are beginning to recover. The Assyrians also are growing in power during this period. But more significantly, internal trouble begins to rear its ugly head. And around this time, a civil war breaks out inside the Mitanni kingdom. According to the records that we do have, a king named Tushratta went to war with his brother. Presumably the brother, known to history as Artatama II, was attempting to usurp the throne or otherwise depose his brother. Something happened here. And this war, by all accounts, was particularly vicious. In fact, at one point, Artatama actually does die. But his son, Shutarna, continues the war against his uncle in this case. The end result of this conflict was pretty nasty in a lot of ways. At the height of it, it drew in the Assyrians. The Assyrian king Shamshi-Adad takes advantage of this to begin asserting his own position and pushing back against the Mitanni. You also begin to see a resurgent Hittite empire begin to push into this. There is a quote, a Hittite record in this case, from the king Suppiluliuma, who, if you've watched our Hittite video, you'll know he leads the imperial resurgence of the Hittites during this period. He mentions going to war with the Mitanni to reclaim territory lost in his grandfather's day. To quote his own account of this, "I freed the lands that I captured. They dwelt in their places. All the people whom I released rejoined their peoples, and Hatti incorporated their territories." Thus, in the minds of the Hittites and their kings, reclaiming what was unrightfully stolen from them and returning the people of Hatti to their rightful rulers. Whether or not the people taken by the Hatti appreciated this or not, the records do not say. All we can say for certain is Mitanni influence begins to fracture at the fringes and begins to retreat in several directions. Ultimately, this saw the rise of a pro-Assyrian faction inside the Mitanni court, which ultimately allowed the Assyrian kings to begin reversing the trend of previous years and actually begin to assert their own influence. In other words, put it bluntly, Mitanni influence over Assyria began to weaken, and Assyrian influence over Mitanni began to rise. This is further complicated by the fact that despite the fact that Shutarna had won his civil war and crowned himself King Shutarna II, upon his death, another dynastic war breaks out. Doubly unfortunately for the Mitanni, this one isn't settled in any way, shape, or form in a way they probably would have liked. Neither king, neither claimant actually wins the war. Instead, the Hittites choose this moment to invade. Under King Suppiluliuma, known as the Great by some for his massive expansion of Hittite power in this period, invades and ultimately will annex Mitanni as a vassal. Again, to go back to the annals of the Hittite king, he claims, "The entire land of Mitanni went to ruin, and the land of Assyria and the land of Alshi divided it between them." This, according to most historians, is probably a little more wishful thinking than actual reality, but we do know that in the years that follow, the Mitanni ultimately are forced to the position of vassalage of the Hittites. But Mitanni history isn't quite over just yet. You see, what happens after this is rather than simply annexing and incorporating the Mitanni into their empire, part of their territory is taken, and instead the Hittites will prop up their new Mitanni vassals and use them more or less as a buffer state against Assyria, which at this period of time the Hittites did fear as a potentially major rival to their own influence in northern Mesopotamia. And really for the rest of Hittite history, the Mitanni will be used in this fashion. Unfortunately, after the Battle of Kadesh, when the Hittites begin to enter into a civil war of their own, Mitanni ultimately loses most of its connections. The Hittites can no longer afford to actually support their vassal, and the Mitanni choose to break away. However, yet another war seems to break out inside the Mitanni court over who will rule this theoretically newly independent state, and ultimately the Assyrians will decide it's an excellent time to bring their former neighbors under their control. And by the reign of King Shalmaneser I of Assyria, Mitanni is totally incorporated into Assyrian territory and becomes part of their so-called Middle Empire.
Ariba-Adad's son, Ashur-uballit, came to the throne of Assyria, and during his reign, he defeated the Mitanni and more or less ended whatever remnant of their empire remained. With the defeat of the Mitanni, the Assyrians once more rose as one of the most prominent powers in the region, and they reopened formal diplomatic relations with Egypt. In the past, Kassite Babylon, the ones who would replace Hammurabi's empire, as we've talked about in the past, had made some open relationships with the Assyrians. They had established treaties, they'd set the borders. It had been fairly amicable. However, in the retraction of Mitanni influence throughout the region, the Kassites seem to believe that the Assyrians should rightfully now be their vassal state, perhaps harkening back to the days of Sargon, when they were simply a northern outpost of the much larger empire. However, with the growing power of Assyria, its military defeat of Mitanni, the Kassites were either unwilling or unable to engage and fight them in outright war. Instead, the Kassite king Bernaburias II entered into a marriage alliance whereby he or his son, or possibly both of them, married Assyrian princesses. While this was successful in stymieing a military conflict between the two powers, what it did end up provoking was a sort of coup d'etat, as after the king Bernaburias II died, his son Kara-Hardash came to the throne and was almost immediately usurped by a sort of army rebellion, as we described further in the Kassite episode. Ashur-uballit, being the grandfather to now the heir to Kara-Hardash, intervened directly in this sort of rebellion and civil war, put into it and installed his own grandson, the son of either Bernaburias II or Kara-Hardash, this individual, Kuradalzu II, onto the throne of Kassite Babylon. The peace lasted for a short time, but by the end of Kurigaldi's reign, he was once again skirmishing with Assyria, and his grandfather had actually gained territory from him in these clashes. In the wake of these victories and the resurgent Middle Assyrian Empire under these rulers, the Assyrians basically became one of the most powerful states in the region, and they engaged in military expansionism. The Egyptians, the Hittites, and Babylon, all at different times, essentially aligned against them, participated in economic boycotts, and in one way or another tried to stymie the growth of the state as every inch of territory it gained was taken from its rivals. The king, Eric Den Ili, subjugated the Gutians, the Turuku, and the Nigimi in Naran, and the Sutians, the Alamu, and the Yaru in the Levant, basically pointing into nomadic people who might threaten the borders of Assyria and stabilizing the fringes of his state. All the while, the Assyrians were contesting their former overlord, piece by piece swallowing the last of the Mitanni.
Came down to two kings, in fact, to finish that job. The first, Adad-nirari I, ultimately oversaw the defeat of the last inner coalition of surviving Mitanni states, essentially breaking their power completely, absorbing a number of them, and ensuring that there was really no hope of any kind of serious Mitanni recovery. And following up the momentum of this, he took the opportunity to push into the eastern parts of Anatolia and butt up even more firmly against the Hittite borders, thus increasing tension in the northern frontier. His successor, Shalmaneser I, will finish the process of swallowing Mitanni territories, and after this point, the Mitanni really are no more an independent power. They are now subject peoples of the Middle Assyrian nation. Interestingly enough, though, Shalmaneser is also noted not just for his military accomplishments. It's also claimed that under his order, a new city known as Nimrud will be constructed, which in the future will become very famous. The libraries of Nimrud being one of the most fruitful sources of archaeological data and surviving literary works from the Assyrian period.
With territory along the Hittite border, a new Assyrian king, Tukulti-Ninurta, launched renewed campaigns there. The last of the remnant pieces of the Mitanni were carved between them, Hanagalbat becoming a vassal province within the Assyrians, and Aleppo and Carchemish becoming Hittite provinces. Now those two great powers were directly competing with each other for territory, not simply carving apart the former remnants between them. In addition to these battles, he also continued to fight the Babylonians and defeated Castilias IV and took him in chains to Ashur. He also ruled directly over Babylon through vassal kings.
One story recounts that briefly after the conquest of Babylon, Tukulti-Ninurta, for a very short time, supposedly made Babylon his capital and declared himself the king of Sumer and Akkad. The position of Babylon as Assyria's capital didn't last terribly long, if it happened at all, but certainly if it did, would have been an extremely powerful symbolic gesture that Babylon, the once mighty heart of the Amorite and later Kassite Empire, was now an Assyrian possession.
However, despite whatever propaganda and cultural value it had, it did not stop Tukulti from tearing the walls of Babylon down and violently sacking the city, as well as once again stealing that statue of Marduk, which seemed to get around the Middle Eastern countryside so frequently. He also in the region defeated the Elamites in Iran, and also conquered the Dilmun area on the coast. After one revolt in the Babylonian lands, Tukulti-Ninurta actually returned and once again attacked the city, but not only did he sack the city, he plundered the temples of Babylon, which were viewed as sacrilegious by his own people and his priesthood. Supposedly, this act of religious sacrilege was so great and the split between his state and that of the priests was so severe and irreparable that he actually created a new capital, Kar Tukulti-Ninurta, or the Port of Tukulti-Ninurta.
No points for originality there.
The city of Kar Tukulti-Ninurta was built just north of Assur. It was abandoned shortly after his death, and nothing else really major comes of that in history. The whole conflict here has been described often as this split between cultural and religious values between different pieces of society and the king, but in reality, I wonder how much this could have actually literally just been a power struggle between the priesthood using this as justification, because as this continues, it seems as though there was some unpopularity among his own people, whether it had to do with statues or whether it had to do with policies inside his own cities. It led to increasingly Tukulti-Ninurta becoming separated from his own supporters and separated from his own people until there was actually a coup launched against him. One or more of his sons actually joined the army in their redressing the grievances of the priesthood and actually launched a siege against his capital city of Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta, and then it ultimately ended with his murder and his son, Ashur-nadir-apli, who ascended the throne and reigned for 4 whole years before also being murdered, possibly as a consequence of the murder of his father. His son, Ashur-nanari III, came to the throne as a child, and his reign was dominated by a vizier, who was actually the vassal king of Hanagolbath, the remnant piece of Mitanni now being ruled over by a king beholden to the Assyrians. This vassal king, Ilpada, who actually descended from the Assyrian king who initially had defeated the Mitanni and broke free from them. However, that child ruler only sat the throne for 6 years until his uncle, Enlil-kudurri-usur, killed him and took the throne. However, he only reigned for 5 years before he was then provoked to battle and defeated by the Kassites, Adad-shuma-usur of Babylon. Records claim that his troops actually handed him over to the Kassite king, perhaps once again being a sort of army coup. Perhaps it was once again internal power struggles or unhappiness among the ranks that led to this king's deposition. And in the wake of all this power struggle, the son of that vizier, Ninurta-apla-ukur, to take control of the army, which had fought the Kassites, and rather than join that of its defeated king, turn around and march back to the Assyrian capital and seize power for himself. However, this usurper king did not last long, because Ashur-dan, the grandson of Tukulti-Ninurta, and consequently also the son of the person who killed Tukulti-Ninurta, took power back from him and actually reigned for 47 years and seemed to stabilize the Assyrian kingdom. During his reign, he led a number of successful military campaigns. He supposedly subdued the Suhu and the Kassite tribes which had threatened the borders, and he also fought conflicts with the Elamite king Shutruk-danhut.
Yet, despite all of this, he was never quite able to retake Babylon despite attempting to do so, which would remain an ambition of the Assyrians for some time to come.
Despite the long reign of supposed stability he returned, after his death there was immediately another succession crisis. Ninurta-Tukulti-Ashur reigned for less than a year till he was deposed by his brother, Mutakil-Nusku. Ninurta-Tukulti-Ashur fled to the provinces, which seemed to remain loyal to him, while the royal center and the major cities backed his brother. These two brothers seem to have gathered their armies and then fought at the site of Sisil, and then disappeared from history, presumably both dying in battle against one another. Interestingly, this time Ashur-dan's reign also corresponds to another major event we just discussed, the Bronze Age collapse. But of all the powers in the Near East, Assyria was the least affected by this collapse, and indeed would almost prosper for the next 150 years. Mutakil-Nusku's son, Ashur-reshi I, reigned contemporaneously with the dynasty of Isin, aka Dynasty IV of Babylon. At this time, the Phrygians migrated into the Asia Minor and finished off the remnants of the Hittite Empire. With the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the abandonment of the border provinces, both Babylon and the Assyrians began to compete. Ultimately, the Assyrians won out in this competition, and they expanded their domain, taking new territory in Asia Minor, old Amorite lands, and even claiming lands that were inhabited by the Gutians and the Kassites and the Zagros.
He in turn was succeeded by Tiglath-Pileser I, who will also manage a reign of about 40 years. Under the reign of this king, who was a very militarily powerful leader, Assyria was able to expand its borders, its dominance, and its position significantly. He fought north, secured the Euphrates rivers, battled in Anatolia against the Hittites, the Phrygians, the Kaskians, even pushed up into Armenia, all the way to Lake Van, according to his own accounts, to fight the Urartans, who again would be a major contender for the Assyrian power in the future. Also, supposedly, pretty strong evidence that yes, attacked Babylon twice during this period. He's also noted for several battles with the Aramaeans in the region of Syria, and he claims to have taken a number of cities in that region that were made famous in the future by the Phoenicians. These are the cities of Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Semira, Berytus, Aradus, and Arvad. Berytus in particular you may have heard of. We call it Beirut today. These grand victories not only massively expanded Assyrian power during his reign, also significantly expanded the standing and prestige and further accelerated the final collapse of whatever remained of the Hittites in Anatolia. To commemorate his grand victories, he ordered the construction of a number of new temples or rebuilding of other existing temples and fortifications in Ashur. Unfortunately, Tiglath-Pileser will become one of the last great kings of the Middle Assyrian period, and the effects of the collapse, long delayed, finally begin to show themselves under the reign of successors.
His son, Ashur-apla-ukur, reigned briefly and was replaced by his brother, Ashur-bokala, who reigned for 18 years. Early in his reign, he confirmed friendly relations with Babylon and campaigned against the pretender king in Syria, Tukulti-Mer. Initially successful, the campaign grew protracted and left Assyria struggling to contain invasions by the Aramean nomads, and intervened in Babylon to install a new successor. By the end of his reign, the Assyrian Empire's borders were shrinking and the Bronze Age collapse had finally caught up to it. Finally, the Bronze Age collapse reaches Assyria, which, given dating, it might have actually been the very early Iron Age, but who knows? The effects of the event which more or less devastated the Hittites, wrecked Canaan, ended the Mycenaeans, and threw Egypt into a backslide, finally seem to have the rippling effects reach the center of the Assyrian Empire. West Semitic peoples, Aramaeans, Chaldeans, Suteans, moved south and west of Assyria, including taking Babylon and Sumer. Indo-Europeans speaking Iranians, Persians, the Medes, and the Parthians moved to Assyria's east and to the areas of Iran and displaced traditional groups there like the Gutians and the Kassites, while also pressuring the kingdoms of Elam and Manasseh. Figurines were the dominant power in the old Hittite lands, and the Hurrians reforged a state known as Urartu. In the north, groups like the Chimerans, the Colchians, and the Scythians had also migrated in. With these waves of nomads and invaders, the Assyrians were faced with a sort of continuous military struggle which left them unable to maintain such a large empire with such large borders covering such a vast area with so many cities and different peoples. The Assyrian Empire essentially had to shrink in the face of this. And in fact, whereas other states had collapsed entirely from these events, after the severing of the trade routes and the violence of the sea peoples, the Hittites and other states vanished almost entirely, or were at the very least left weakened to such a point they were able to be conquered shortly thereafter. The Assyrians instead abandoned their outer empires, suffered military defeats, and retracted, but they maintained a sort of stable, if constantly under siege, under threat core around Assyria and the other old royal center. They also maintained small satellite colonies stretching outward, claiming valuable resources in order to maintain some power in the region. This control of the area around the capital and the maintaining of various vital resources also meant the trade routes were actually continuing to be open. These powers moving into the regions had interest in gaining those resources, and so thus the trade routes actually still flowed through Assyria. And while Assyria was experiencing this violent, tumultuous period of nomadic invasions, they were not left completely helpless, and they were still maintaining some small control over their neighborhood. Ashur-bal-Khal's son, Shamshi-Adad II, ruled for only 2 years before, once again, being deposed by an uncle. Shamshi-Adad IV, who then ruled for only 4 years. During the reign of his son, Ashurbanipal I, the Assyrian histories record continuing war with tribes and also experience of famines during this time. This period has less remaining records compared to others, and as a result, little is known about the reigns of Shalmaneser II, Ashur-Ninari IV, Ashur-Rabi II, Ashur-Ishi II, and Tiglath-Pileser II. However, the 101st name on the Assyrian king list, Ashur-Dan II, is known as the last king of the Middle Assyrian Empire, which by this time had already collapsed, and possibly the first king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He was the first Assyrian king to conduct regular military campaigns in a century. He conquered Kadmuhu in the northeast, and he publicly displayed the flayed skin of its king. The aim was to gain the bronze, tin, and gems Kadmuhu had access to. The Assyrian histories claim that the Aramaeans had driven out or enslaved the Assyrians of the Western Empire, and Ashur-Dan II claimed to have reconquered these areas and returned the Assyrians to their homes. After expanding the borders once more, Ashur-Dan reorganized the provinces and the imperial bureaucracy. In this era, it appears to have been truly an empire, a multi-ethnic, highly organized state whose identity was tied to that of the emperor. In fact, previous identities, the ancient identity of the Assyrians, whether it be Hurrian or Amorite, have been replaced. The, in fact, distinction of Akkadian and Sumerian and even Syrian culture was somewhat replaced, as Akkadian no longer became the sole language, and it was instead used side by side with Imperial Aramaean, the language of some of these nomadic groups, which they had adopted simply because it was an easier thing to record than the ancient, fairly archaic and unwieldy cuneiform. Likely groups like the Kassites, the Amorites, the Gutians, even others who have been driven from their lands by these new groups might have come to Assyrian lands, given the long ties they had there and given the large scale of its empire and how it incorporated these people, and that As time passed, it was that the imperial center became the most safe region, the most stable region. More and more of these people might have likely come, and you could have easily imagined a Assyrian collapse whereby as the empire fell and more provinces fell out of the direct control of the Assyrian Empire, more of these people, whether they be Assyrian, Akkadian, Kassite, Amorite, even Aramaeans who had joined the empire, migrate into the core, and sort of this identity no longer became one of tribal lines, but became one of identifying with this state, with this ideology, with the emperor and his army of the empire that once was, and the empire that they claimed would be restored. So in the face of this, as the collapse changed the entire region, left so many areas reeling and unable to cope with the stresses, Assyria had maintained this core of stable cities and royal holdings. And with this secure position, and with their military might that they had cultivated in the centuries past, the experience they had gained fighting these nomads, all of a sudden when the chaos and the strife and the violence recedes for just a moment, the Assyrians find themselves in the most advantageous position they have ever been in the history of their nation.
Thank you for listening to the 5th episode of our series in Mesopotamia. This has been the History Hour, and we'd appreciate any likes, favorites, and/or comments you have for us. Check the video description for links to YouTube, Patreon, and other platforms. See you next time.
Welcome to the lightning round, where we discuss fun little facts that didn't make it to the main episode. So, during the rough contemporary time of Shamshi-Adad I of the old Assyrian Empire, there was a Naram-Sin of Assyria who is actually mentioned on the king's list, in addition to Naram-Sin of Eshnunna, who famously kicked out Shamshi-Adad from Ekhlatum and sent him in exile to Babylon. These might have possibly been the same person, but at the same time, there was also a Naram-Sin who reigned in Uruk roughly contemporaneously, this being probably removed from the Sargonic Naram-Sin. So it's kind of like if you ever hear, oh, everyone named their kid Cody in 1993. Well, it was just one of those years where everyone and their dog were naming their frickin' kid Naram-Sin.
And throughout Assyrian history, one of the most important sort of recreational activities of kings was hunting. This served a number of purposes, sort of reinforced their old pastoral nomadic traditions. It also demonstrated the king's strength and power, his mastery over the wild beasts, his prowess as a warrior, etc., etc., and Assyrian hunting scenes are in fact quite famous. Well, during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, after his successful conquest of Syrian cities, he decided to celebrate his recent successes with a hunting trip. Okay, pretty normal. Rather than saying, hey guys, get the chariots and the spears and the arrows, he said, guys, build a boat. Well, he's the king, they built a boat, and they went out into the Mediterranean, where it is said that the king speared a Nahiru, or seahorse. Some historians think that might have been a narwhal.
Which is slightly bizarre, since as far as I and Wikipedia are concerned, narwhals appear to be an Arctic mammal. I'm not sure what they're doing in the Med. Interestingly, near the end of the middle of the Syrian Empire, when the empire was in collapse, and typically people are saying that the empire had reached its end point, and these were sort of intermediate kings. Despite the violent, hectic circumstances of the Aramaean invasions, Ashur-bel-Kala did have time to build himself both a zoo and a botanical garden, which is kind of interesting, because wasn't there a story about the Assyrian Museum in later periods?
Well, it was actually the Neo-Babylonians. But yes, there was a period later on when a king constructed a museum which put the artifacts, some dating all the way back to the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Confused the hell out of archaeologists when they found it, wondering why all these artifacts at various times were on the same excavation layer before someone realized, oh wait, this is a museum, isn't it? I suppose it's not the most intuitive thing to think, but these people work for museums, so you'd think they might have thought of that at some point, but
It can often be shocking how modern ancient people acted at times.